we talk about equitable transit-oriented development and what that really means. I'm talking about starting with people. And it's the whole concept of shared streets of kind of shifting the focus from cars to people is a key component of that. And I think that what we've heard here today is that this kind of experimentation that has been happening with street interventions of kind of taking what people are hearing from communities, hearing from cities, and letting them kind of lead the way, getting the bureaucracy out of the way, that is making a huge difference in promoting equity.
And good morning and welcome to another in our TOD Talks, as we call them, TOD standing for Transit-Oriented Development. And this one this morning is entitled, Can Shared Streets Pave the Way for Equity? Before we get going, we're going to just observe a moment of silence and remember those who have lost their lives and been seriously injured in accidents involving cars, pedestrians, and cyclists, so many of whom have passed in our community due to unsafe streets and unsafe situations. Okay, thank you. And that's important as we focus in on the purpose of what we're talking about this morning, which is to make all of our streets safer. Participating this morning, as usual, Tracy Corley, who is MassINC's Transit-Oriented Development Fellow, who has organized this whole series. And we want to thank Tracy for doing that and being here with us again this morning. Good morning, Tracy.
Good morning, Bob.
David Kucharsky is the Director of Traffic and Parking for the City of Salem. He's responsible for the city's transportation policy program and planning implementation and development. And we welcome Kate Fichter, who's Assistant Secretary for Policy Coordination at Massachusetts Department of Transportation, where she has served in various capacities since 2004. Currently, she is responsible for overseeing multiple policy initiatives and ensuring that MassDOT policy priorities are implemented through investments and projects. And finally, all the way from the West Coast, Oakland, California, we welcome Warren Logan, who's the Policy Director of Mobility and Interagency Relations at Oakland Mayor's Office. His role focuses on advancing that city's vision for safe and sustainable transportation for all Oaklanders. Welcome to you all this morning. We're going to begin with a poll question for you. When we say shared streets, what word or words come to mind? And if you would submit your answers to us, that'd be great. We get a chance to see what is on your mind and what you think shared streets means. And we're going to begin with Tracy Corley. Tracy, why don't you introduce us to this topic?
Yes. And so just for our audience today, first of all, welcome. I want to echo Bob's welcome to everyone today. But just wanted to provide a little information just so you know kind of what we're talking about as we kind of dive into the conversation today about the different types of street interventions that are out there. We have a graphic to kind of show the differences between the different types of street interventions. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about shared streets and slow streets. But we also have other ways in which communities can actually make modifications to streets in order to address a variety of different policy concerns, including open streets, school streets, street trees, and complete streets. And so all of these are different types of programs and interventions. Here in the state of Massachusetts, we have a very specific grant program called the Shared Streets Program, with which Kate Fichter will talk a little bit more about today. And as we'll hear also from Warren Logan out in Oakland about the Open Streets Program. And sorry, I didn't mean to overlook you, Dave. You will also be talking with us also about the Shared Streets Program and its implementation in Salem. But we just want to give you an idea as to kind of what these different programs are based upon some of the research that we've done as to the different ways in which communities across the country have been implementing these programs. But here, I think we also included in the description of this event today that MassDOT has done just a whirlwind of a job of getting funding out to, if I recall correctly, 103 different projects over the course of the past 100 days, over the course of 100 days, which is just phenomenal in terms of just speed of kind of deploying funds to communities to kind of address these kinds of issues. And we also have a map that kind of shows kind of where these grants went. I hope that you can see the dots there with all of their kind of gray colored dots to kind of show where all the programs were. We've also highlighted because of course we at the Gateway Cities Innovation Institute are interested in kind of what the impacts have been on our gateway cities. And it just so happens that out of the 26 gateway cities, 20 of them actually received funding for shared streets programs for 27 different projects. And 14 of those projects happen to be in the transit-oriented development districts, those areas around commuter rail stations or passenger rail stations in those local communities. And so this kind of gives you just a sense of just the scale and the scope of kind of what has taken place here in Massachusetts so far. But now I'm going to just turn it back over to Bob so we can just kind of really dive into some conversation as to kind of what this has meant for communities, both here in Massachusetts as well as out in Oakland, California. So Bob?
Thank you so much, Tracy. And let's see, we do have some answers to our poll. Here we go. When we say shared streets, word comes to mind. Safety is at the almost the top of that list at 70%. Public space is 78% of our participants this morning mentioned public space. Recreation, 48%. Outdoor dining, 38%. Street vendors, 23%. Cultural activity, 43%, and 25% said artwork. So I want to thank you for those contributions. We're going to begin with Kate Fichter from MassDOT. Of course, a lot of these projects and ideas are great on their own, but they've really come about because of the whole COVID pandemic. So Kate, why don't you give us a little background on how this whole Shared Streets program got started and what the intent is?
Sure, and thank you, and good morning, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk about this program, which has been incredibly important to us at MassDOT for the last couple of months. I think like everybody, when COVID started and everybody was sent home and the world sort of turned upside down, we as transportation planners and professionals were trying to figure out if there was anything at all that we could do to be helpful. And it took us a bit to figure out what might make sense, particularly in the world of Massachusetts, where most transportation infrastructure is owned and controlled by cities and towns, as are many things here. And actually with inspiration from a number of other cities around the world, including Oakland, we decided that what would make the most sense for us would be to try to actually pass money to municipalities to allow them to realize their own ideas and plans. And I think where it started was really in response to COVID. It was giving people more space to walk and bike. We saw a sudden explosion of people home during the days and looking for ways to get outside. And also the real importance of commerce and particularly dining. I'm interested to see that outdoor dining rated relatively low on your poll, because certainly that was a huge proportion of the types of projects that we saw. So it began in response to COVID. It was quick, and we put together something that makes sense. And over the 3 or so months that we ran the program, we saw it shift to becoming really a way for municipalities to invest in things that they'd been thinking about for a long time around policy priorities for bicyclists and pedestrians, public transit, children, older people, all sorts of things related to safety and to public space.
Okay, we will turn to you again shortly, but let's hear from David Kucharsky now about examples of some of these shared streets projects in his city. David?
Thank you. So early on in the pandemic, the mayor had put together a task force, an economic development task force to focus on trying to help the businesses out that were obviously suffering with the downturn and everything going on. So I was part of a team essentially looking at how we rethink our public spaces, our right-of-ways. We worked with a local business program called Creative Collective. We put a survey out to the local businesses to get a sense of what they needed, what they were looking for. We developed an intake application form, and then we went out and started evaluating how do we create these outdoor dining spaces with the goal of ensuring that they're safe, not just from a health perspective, and here's some images now, not from just from a health perspective, but also physically from existing traffic and separation of patrons and the general public. A lot of that focus was in the downtown. That business program we worked with called Creative Collective. These are some of the photos that they took. In addition to being safe, they needed to be accessible. We wanted to make sure you might see a little ramp there in the corner. We worked with a lot of local welders, carpenters to create some parklets in certain cases, ramps in others. And also the mayor wanted them to look good. They wanted them to be inviting. So we worked with a lot of local artists to paint a lot of these Jersey barriers that don't really have much. I think it brought out a lot of creativity, and it was certainly a huge effort. And while this was going on, we started hearing more about the Shared Streets program, things that were going on in other parts of the country. And then we learned about the grant opportunities that the Barr and Solomon Foundation had working with MassDOT. And we sort of pivoted and started looking at how we can help residential areas open up their streets and make them safer. So we put together a list of locations, and we did essentially a shared streets pilot at 4 locations around the city. This is one area where we were actually working on the installation. We worked with a local consultant called Neighbor Ways, which helped us a lot with the community engagement. We were able to get residents to actually help us and assist us with it. So that was certainly helpful, because one thing we found is it's difficult to have a lot of the staff to implement this. And one thing I know with the Shared Streets program that the state offered, the technical assistance was certainly something that we appreciated, where we could bring consultants on to help us develop plans and then have the funding to execute it. So those were just a few of the things that we were able to do as a result of all this. And I think we're still evaluating everything, but it certainly has, I think, changed the people's perceptions. And we took out a lot of parking, I'll say, which is usually a third rail subject. And for the most part, we didn't get that much pushback. So
we're lucky. All right. Thank you, David. Of course, one of the things that happened after the pandemic began was there was a lot less traffic, but some of the traffic that remained was very fast. You had people driving very fast, and there was a lot of concern about slow streets. And I noticed Logan out there in Oakland, that was one of your priorities in your projects out there. Tell us about that.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. You know, it's interesting to hear David's perspective about starting with the commercial streets and then shifting to residential streets. In Oakland, we did the opposite. Just shortly after our shelter in place, we recognized, just as you shared, Bob, that, you know, Oakland doesn't have very much traffic to begin with, no matter what people tell you. And as folks were, you know, no longer commuting, we found that the reckless drivers, very reckless drivers that were always on our street, were the only ones on our street. And recognizing that our hospitals were projected to be full in just a month or two, we wanted to make sure that we were, you know, reducing any type of exposure people might have to having to go to the hospital, right? Like, to be blunt. So what we did was we actually looked no further than our recently adopted bicycle plan. It's called Let's Bike Oakland, and pulled out the 74-mile network that's neighborhood bikeways and said, well, these are the streets that our residents just told us they wanted to feel safe bicycling and walking in their neighborhoods. Let's start there. And soon after, the mayor sort of designated all of those streets as eligible for the slow streets treatment, which is just closure to through traffic. And I think that's sort of a term of art that is not quite listed, Tracy, in your list, is that our slow streets actually still allow the residents who live there to drive on and off of their block. What's interesting, though, of course, is that shared for us means let's put people first, and then cars, not even second, third, fourth, fifth, you know, eighth, right? What's interesting also is that shortly after our Slow Streets program, we then started what's called our Flex Streets program, which is sort of the business equivalent. We have parklets, we have full street closures, and even just cafe seating. Some other components of our kind of creative use of public rights of way, as I call them, I guess. A lot of people haven't noticed, I suppose, that we also have an Essential Places program, which is sort of helping people cross major arterials. So instead of focusing on, I would say, the low-hanging fruit of neighborhood residential streets, we've taken sort of a bigger bite of the apple and said, where are all the locations that people are trying to get to, grocery stores, food distribution, clinics, hospitals, schools, how do we help people get there safely? And where are the places that we know are already dangerous? Let's be proactive about helping people feel safe getting to, again, essential places. Perhaps the program that has gotten the least amount of attention, and I would say the most important, is another one that I run, where the city has offered all of our land and streets for COVID testing. So around the city, we've partnered with the county, again, to sort of share our space for COVID testing for health and wellness programs. And while it's not perhaps of national acclaim, I think our Slow Streets has gotten a lot of wonderful attention. That's actually the major focus of our program, is COVID first, right? And helping people where they are and what they need, whether that's, COVID testing, access to essential places, business, and recreational purposes.
Thank you, Warren. That's a fascinating contrast and a really important one. We have a second poll question I'd like to introduce to our participants right now. We're simply asking, have you seen changes in your community streets in 2020? So either yes, no, or not sure. Let us know what you think.
Bob,
Yes.
if you don't mind, I just want to jump in because I just want to remind our audience that, Warren made a really great point in talking about kind of the role of partnering the city with the county. And as here in Massachusetts, we don't have strong county government. Actually, I think very few of our counties actually have any type of sitting government. And so as a result, with our cities being out there on their own, I think that the partnership that has kind of emerged out of working directly with the Department of Transportation is kind of filling, I think, some of that kind of gap of kind of what's happening between the city and the county in California. Just want people to just be reminded of that and aware of that.
Well, that's a good point. Kate, I'd like to turn back to you. When you hear Warren talking about kind of COVID being the priority for a lot of these projects, what's your reaction to that, especially with winter coming on and people anticipating that COVID may indeed get worse?
I mean, I think it's exactly right, and I think for us, it's reinforced in a couple of different ways. The funding source that we are actually using for the new phase of our Shared Streets program is some of our federal COVID relief money, which really underscores the importance of the connection between the effort and COVID itself. I think that I think for us, the program was really twofold. It was an immediate response to COVID as best we could sort of figure out how to do it, which was giving people more and safer space to be outside and giving places for people to eat or shop or do other things that would normally be inside, suddenly be outside. But it was also a way, as we've all been saying, to kind of encourage longstanding policy priorities around safety, around sharing streets better with non-vehicular modes, with making the world a safer place for kids and for everybody who's walking and biking. So it met both COVID needs and some sort of universal needs in the transportation world. But I think where COVID really made a difference, and David sort of referenced this, was just in the urgency it was able to bring to this effort. Any one of these projects could have taken years to evolve in a normal world, in a place where Massachusetts hates any kind of change. Suddenly, a lot of the obstacles that I think communities and the state and everybody runs into when trying to do things like remove on-street parking or repurpose some area that's been used for one particular way for a long time, or shift the balance of control among modes in a street, those things can be incredibly hard. And there was something about the kind of collective urgency of COVID that allowed people to think bigger and be more open. And even us, we realized that we had to sort of get out of the way as well. So that gave it the impetus, I think, that made a lot of other things possible.
And Kate, just to follow up on that, just for a second, to give numbers to what you're sharing, our Slow Streets program went from the mayor texting myself and our department director on let's say a week and a half before we launched Slow Streets and rolled out the first 5 Slow Streets, right? We now have over 20 miles of Slow Streets in, I want to say, a matter of 6 months. And we have 20 essential places in about 5 months. We went from having, I think, a total of 4 parklets in the city to, I want to say, 80 Flex Street applications. So that's not all parklets, but there are whole corridors now in Oakland that are just parklets. And just to your point, Kate, and I think, David, you brought this up too, the third rail of parking, right? Some of our neighborhoods that were over my dead body, shall you take this parking spot, are now almost entirely parklets. And just to kind of put a cherry on that, I'm thinking of one street that just last year demanded that we move their street up in the priority for repaving. And this year, just as we were about to roll out that fresh pavement, they've asked us to delay it because we would have to remove their parklets for the 2 weeks to implement the paving. And so I think what's really interesting, and Kate, I want to put a exclamation point on it, is that the urgency is the element that people should be focusing on. The interdepartmental collaboration is what's making this work. And then by extension, I think, especially in the case of Oakland, the willingness to accept that it's not going to be perfect, and that our leadership, including all the way up to our mayor, has said, it's okay if you've made a mistake, right? I want you to do something, and that the no build option that we're all familiar with is not an option, right? Like not doing something is not on the menu. And I think that has changed the paradigm with which we confront many of these issues.
Good point.
We have to act.
We asked people about if they've seen changes on their own streets in their community. We've asked a yes or no question there, but if you could put in the Q&A tab what changes you have seen, that would be interesting as well. 88% of you say you have seen changes in your community streets in 2020. Just 9% said no, so that's very encouraging. One of the things that, David, I'd like to talk to you about is that, all of these projects, they all, sometimes, as we mentioned, once they're implemented, people get to like them. But there are some things that maybe don't work out in terms of what may look good on paper or doesn't work well on streets. Has that been the case in Salem at all? Have you had to make changes to what you were planning?
Certainly. So just going back to the pilot that we instituted, it ran for about 3 months. We looked at 4 locations throughout the city. We initially were looking at 2 that were in the Point neighborhood, and then we used some city funds to do some other locations that we had already identified through the city's neighborhood traffic calming program. So when we implemented these just beforehand, we collected some traffic data, and then we also collected traffic data, speed and volume counts during the pilot itself. We did 2 things in each case. It was trying to reduce vehicle speeds, and then over a certain time, reduce through traffic. And we only did this through Fridays through Sunday. That was what we were able to get in. So looking at that, we received a lot of pushback on the traffic diversions, particularly on the adjacent streets. That was something that we certainly identified, not only anecdotally, but what we captured with the actual data that we were able to get. But overall, the instituting speed cushions, and you saw in one of those photos earlier with the barrels, was a hit. People want those. There was hesitancy. I think many communities in New England saying, what are you going to do when it snows? What, with the plows, emergency vehicles? We heard everything. But once we put those in these locations, I forgot to mention that as part of this, we had started a community engagement website where we allowed everyone to comment on each of these locations. And it also allowed us to do a survey. We, I think, got somewhere between 800 and 900 responses out of that. And it resulted in 90 additional streets being identified by residents, as well as people wanting to volunteer their time to help either put soil in a planter and make sure that it gets watered, things like that. So I'd say we certainly the elements to reduce traffic speeds was embraced. We're still working on those traffic diversions. So we're trying to maybe take more of a neighborhood zone approach where we're not just focusing on one particular street, but look at many parallel streets and see really how traffic is circulating through the city.
David, do you see increasing support for what you're doing as you push through this process?
I'd say in certain cases, yes. Like I said, the results of our service are showing that the traffic calming elements are certainly something that people support, and opening these streets up to different users. Ooh. All right.
Even though in the beginning they might have had some strong opposition to it.
Yes, correct. And again, we're still sort of fighting that through traffic piece of it. So
And I'd like to ask Kate, I know that, a lot of these projects are, they sound really good and the communities are behind them, but there was one notable one in Northampton where they really had to take everything down because the business people were so upset with the lane being taken right in front of their businesses. So how is that dealt with? How do you make sure that the project that's going forward really is going to be supported?
So it's an interesting question. So when we were first putting together the program, we spent a lot of time internally debating with ourselves about how much information we needed to request from the municipalities. And in a normal world, we request, reams of information. We're very, we micromanage anything that we allow municipalities to do with our money. And we really challenged ourselves to say, what do we really absolutely have to ensure, and what can we actually allow to happen and evolve at the local level? And ultimately, we decided that the only things we really had to hold for ourselves were to make sure that all of the ADA rules were being met, and to make sure that local fire and first responder and other public safety folks had signed off. Like that was our bare minimum. So we posited an experiment, which is let us not try to micromanage the public involvement piece and see what happens. And with the theory that the feedback loop at the local level would work if a project was unpopular, as David is mentioning. So Northampton, obviously a notable example. By coincidence, I was there with my family in the week before the interventions actually came down. That is the only project of the 123 that we have funded that has had to be removed. And actually my understanding is that they just repurposed and kind of moved around the stuff, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I can count on like the fingers of one hand the number of concerns that found their way up to us, which again is amazing. And I don't know whether to attribute that to the fact that every municipality just did a bang up job on public involvement before they started. My guess is probably not, or that this is stuff that people really wanted, and when they saw it, they really were like, this is great. Or some combination thereof. I will be curious to see what happens in the second round. This time around, having learned from Northampton, we are actually going to require municipalities to at least attest that they have done a public notice process, bare minimum. And they will get extra credit in the scoring if they can show that they've done more than that. But again, we're trying to kind of push as much of the ownership of this down to the local level and really allow these projects to, as best as we can, kind of reflect local needs. And if it doesn't work at the local level, they figure that out. But it's been a very interesting process in letting go for us and seeing what happens.
Some comments we've had on the Q&A about changes that people have seen. Ron says, can we use shared streets to move live performances from indoor stages to outdoor ones? Christine says, I've seen more outdoor seating in the streets. Outdoor dining in Davis Square, Winchester Center, and other places, and streeteries in Worcester gets a big exclamation point. And then Sarah Brown from Brown Anson from Greenfield said there was only one restaurant with outdoor dining, and almost every restaurant worked with the city to take over parking or small streets for outdoor dining. Unfortunately, the street changes ended November 1st, and she hopes this continues next year and beyond. What about that? Keeping these changes. We mentioned snow and other things that maybe Warren doesn't have to deal with in Oakland, but we have to hear. What about how making it through the winter with some of these changes?
We're starting to hear from certain businesses that want the outdoor seating to be pulled so that they can go back to pick up and take out with the parking spaces. That was something we initially did before we were able to set up any of the seating. Was we had designated a lot of short-term parking that were long-term spaces for that purpose. So we've gotten a few of those requests, not a lot. I think the weather overall still has been good. So I think the businesses are trying to eke out as much of that as possible, but we're certainly going to need to pivot and think about that. We have ordered and assisted some businesses to get those outside heaters, which I know are sort of become as scarce as toilet paper was at some point. So, we're certainly trying to, I think again, we'll be approaching the businesses to see what they want, see how we can assist on that front.
One thing I would share though, in this idea of permanence, and it's funny because
I was actually just going to ask you, Warren,
oh.
about the snow. What about these changes you're making becoming permanent?
I'm a mind reader, Bob. That's really what it is. I think one of the aspects about our program we've actually been talking about, because while it does not snow here, we might get rain soon, which God, we need it, is that I actually am starting to question whether or not it has to be permanent in the way that people are thinking about it, right? That like every slow street that's out there needs to have like a stronger sign forever and ever on end. What we've heard from a number of residents and even business owners especially is that the flexibility around which we can respond to different needs, whether it's seasonality, whether it's business influx, is actually the thing that should be permanent, right? Like flexibility should be permanent. So for example, a number of the streets that we had, positioned as slow streets at first and got a lot of pushback from, the neighbors had said, it's not like we're against safe streets. It's just that we're still essential workers. We're not playing in the street. We still have to drive to work. On the weekends, on the other hand, we'd love to see an opportunity to close the street entirely because we're not going anywhere. Is that an option, right? Similarly, a number of the parents, in sort of our more affluent neighborhoods have said, this has been a great boon during the summer months when the kids are at home, they can play out in the street. But at some point, we might need to not reverse course, but shift back to a more commute model. But then when school is out again, we close the streets down for the kids to play. Similarly, and I think about our parklets, our cafe seating, our even street closures, we rewrote 5 different types of encroachment permits throughout the city. And, again, like I said before, we had like 4 parklets and now we have like 20, right? The fact that we are now allowing these sort of quick pop-up and even potentially quick, not demolish, but take away, means that perhaps for the times in which it is appropriate to have or comfortable to have outdoor dining en masse, we should allow that. And then when it's not appropriate or not comfortable, then we just shut it down, right? But that it doesn't necessarily mean that we always have to have this be permanent. I think that's where, when we're talking about community engagement, that's where we start to see pushback, and especially that extreme sort of visceral reaction, is because people are projecting the future to be like, it's always going to be this way. No. Versus, maybe for a couple of weeks while it's nice and sunny, yeah, of course, let's do that. But then later on, let's change it. Mm-hmm. Notice that the engagement stress, if you will, has gone down when you start to say, let's just try it for a week. And if it's not working, I'm going to pick up this A-frame barricade and move it over here. It has just calmed the environment down a bit, I think.
Well, actually, let me jump in and ask, this is a great segue into kind of talking a little bit more about equity, because I'm really concerned, and I want to ask, all of our guests, who decides when it's needed and when it isn't, and how do you kind of make that decision? What are you hearing from, the folks who are currently participating in the slow streets as well as the shared streets program, as to kind of like how they're seeing, when the flexibility should be flexed. And then also, moving forward, how do we kind of make sure that gets baked in, and that those communities who historically have not had a voice in kind of helping to decide, how their communities get planned, how do we make sure that they are heard in this process?
Well, Tracy, I can kind of touch on that first, I suppose. It's that, I'll be honest, and perhaps the first to say, when we first launched Slow Streets, a big portion of East Oakland, which is our sort of like less affluent POC neighborhoods, were, I would say, furious with us. Like that, I was on an apology tour for a while, but I might still be on this apology tour. But I will argue first that their frustrations, first of all, were valid. And it wasn't just like, we don't want safety. This is not our version of safety. We're essential workers. We don't have the privilege of jogging in the street like North Oaklanders do. And so that's why we created then the sub-program Essential Places. So most of the essential places are in East and West Oakland, where our priority neighborhoods are, right? So almost from the jump, like we started being flexible about what people wanted. Similarly, though, and this is the part that I've challenged my staff to consider, is that when you look at a map and say, well, where are all the flex streets? Where are all the slow streets? Where are all the essential places? If you just look at any one of those individually, you might say, this is not an equitable distribution of resources. It's not an equitable program. But I said, put them all together, right? Like put them all on the same map. And you start to see that for whichever neighborhood needs whichever tool, they have that, right? We only offer testing in our rights of way and on city land in East Oakland and West Oakland, right? Like that's where all of our testing is because that's the hotspot for COVID, right? So it is not so much that we're evaluating, does everyone have access to a slow street? It's, does everyone have access to the creative use of public rights of way that they need for that time? And when you look at it that way, absolutely, we're being an equitable, distribution of resources.
I'd like to remind our participants, if they have any questions, please let us know through the Q&A tab. And the final poll question is, do you think the street improvements that you see will create lasting changes in how your community uses streets? I'd like to ask all of you, and we can go back to Tracy's equity question too as well, because you want to make sure, there's a lot of emphasis, especially here in Massachusetts, about outdoor dining and commercial use of public space. Does that in any way inhibit the uses of streets and sidewalks that people in the community might, feel that is needed and they're being ignored? Are we making sure that everyone is being heard in this process, Kate?
So let me speak to that a little bit, actually, and I'll start by going back to the Northampton example, because something happened there that I actually didn't anticipate, and that was very interesting. As I understand what happened there, or the perception of what happened, was that parking spaces that the businesses felt were kind of theirs for their customers were used for restaurants to have outdoor dining. So you wound up in the situation with like two private businesses sort of pitted against each other, at least so they perceived, which was not at all something I had expected. And makes sense. And I think that in general, when you are talking about using public funding or public support or public space for what is essentially a private enterprise, even if having a lot of stuff on the sidewalk sort of activates it for everybody, that's a challenge. And that's something that we were very mindful of. And one of the things that pleased me was that we saw applications for various types of outdoor dining and commerce coming from all types of municipalities around the Commonwealth. It was not just from the affluent ones, it was from all kinds of places and all kinds of restaurants, from everything from like the simplest pizzeria to like a really fancy restaurant. So that in some ways I felt more comfortable with that than I might have. And I guess we felt like at the state level, our sort of efforts to both make technical assistance available for free for every municipality. We know how much professional capacity is an impediment for many of our municipalities. So being able to give them access to consultant services and design services they might not have been able to afford normally, like we felt like that was a big thing that we could do to try to level the playing field. We know it's never level, but to do our best. And in various kinds of ways, we prioritized and gave preference to our municipalities that are designated as environmental justice municipalities under the federal guidance. So we tried from that perspective, but after that, in terms of outcomes, we had to have faith that the local governments were doing what they needed to do at their level to work with their communities, work with their neighborhoods and their sub-neighborhoods to do things that both combined what sort of the professional planners thought would be helpful for safety or helpful for commerce, but also reflected what people were saying they needed in that moment. I hope that most of them hit the mark. I'm sure we'll hear more when we do more evaluation. But we did try to figure out how we could affect that from our level, and then keep our fingers crossed that everything, more or less worked as we would have wanted.
Okay, we do have several questions. Some of them deal specifically with Massachusetts about how are projects ranked and what are the criteria for ranking? And you may all want to respond to this as well, but we could start with Kate and maybe hear from Warren about how they do that out in Oakland.
So for us, so a couple of things. We actually have the sort of project scoring criteria on the website for the program, but we had a whole series of project elements that were sort of things that we deemed were eligible under this like large envelope of shared streets. And if you had one of those, you got points for it. If you had a better one, you got more points. If you had a less interesting one, you got fewer. We gave extra points, as I mentioned, for environmental justice communities, for any project that had a dedicated bus lane. We're really emphasizing bus lanes, so we gave extra bonus points for that. As the program went on, we started giving preference to communities that were in our red COVID designation for high infection rates. And, you know, we tried to be responsive to sort of what was happening in the real world, but we were looking for projects that, broadly speaking, would help with safety, mainly for pedestrians and cyclists, that were not simply a picnic table, but they were several picnic tables combined with a new crosswalk, combined with a new ramp, and maybe a pedestrian flashing beacon. We wanted things that integrated both the mobility elements, since we are a transportation agency, and the funding we were using in large part was transportation money. But we wanted to see it done creatively. We love seeing the art, like what David mentioned. Other projects got community groups involved in different kinds of ways. We were looking for things that combined a bunch of different ideas and that seemed to have local support as best we were able to figure it out.
And David, in Salem, did people come to you, or did you go out and survey the city? You know, or was it a combination of things?
So I mentioned earlier, we had a neighborhood traffic calming program. So we have applications that come in from residents, proponents, where we ask for them to describe what their issues are, have a petition. So we really get a sense of, is this one single individual, or is it a whole neighborhood living on a particular street? So we were looking at that when we were identifying the streets where we wanted to implement the shared streets pilot. We also, similar to what Warren did, we looked at our bike master plan, which the city adopted in 2018, and looked at that, as well as proximity to environmental justice communities, as well as to schools. One of the projects that we received through MassDOT was Wilson Street, which is adjacent to a local elementary school and high school, where we put in buffered bike lanes, improved some of the school zone features there. So we were really basing it on previous work in order to justify the implementation. We still got pushback in some cases that we're in the process of dealing with, but I'm happy to go into that if you want, but that's really where a lot of this came from.
And Warren, out in Oakland, you know, how do you rank projects, and what do you consider?
Yeah, it's actually been kind of interesting to listen to Kate's approach, and granted, we're talking about different levels of government, right? So like, I'm just operating at one city level. We don't really, for as much as we're ranking anything, maybe I'll describe a little bit of the application process for the program. So Slow Streets, which is our residential neighborhood, you know, traffic calming, that's the city proactively placing these A-frame barricades around the city. As we've started to enter into phase 2 of the program, we're prioritizing our priority neighborhoods. So the region, our statistical metropolitan region, has what are called communities of concern. And I hate that terminology. And so our team switched that to say, these are the neighborhoods that we are prioritizing for a number of reasons. We're not concerned about you, we are prioritizing you. So identifying those priority neighborhoods and saying, okay, for the neighborhoods that, and the slow streets that are within those, engaging with those communities first, prioritizing their needs first, whether that is a slow street, whether it's transitioning to an essential place, or considering altogether removing that slow street and doing testing on their block, for example. And it so happens that I sort of manage all of these different shells, so I can switch them around. In terms of flex streets though, and Kate, it's been really interesting to kind of listen to you talk about parking again, especially, is that we just decided to kind of split the baby. We told every single business that, if you take their parcel line, right, like my property's from here to here, whichever parking spaces are directly out front, we're just going to call that theirs, and you can do whatever you want with it. And if you want more than that, get your neighbor to sign off on it. And while obviously that has its own implications about, private space, public space, private use, our team does not have the bandwidth to debate like this third rail parking. And we just said, you know what? It's better that we just allow this type of, what is now actually an automatic permitting system. So all you do is you take a photo of those two spaces in front of you, you take a photo from the parking back to your business and from each side, and we will literally accept a sketch on a napkin of what you want to do. And then as long as we can see that there's no fire hydrant and that like there's a ramp, you're good to go. Like that's it. And so it has taught us that, I think you mentioned this too, Kate, that while obviously there have been some challenges with a couple, the fact that there's only been one major concern of any of the parklets that have been launched, right, of 6 months of just a free-for-all, has told us that our program probably doesn't need to have a we don't need to have a stranglehold on this type of a system, right? And that it has allowed us, and this gets us back to Tracy's point about equity, it has enabled us to focus on the priority neighborhoods. But if I'm spending all of my bandwidth and my staff's bandwidth focusing on coddling and holding hands with all the most affluent neighborhoods that are just going to debate, no, that's my parking spot, no, that's my parking spot, like, I can't then devote that attention to the neighborhoods that haven't heard of this program, don't know how to apply to it, don't have the money. Put that aside so that we can spend our resources, right? Our time and our energy is also a resource that needs to be distributed equitably. And so that's what we've been focusing on for the last 7 or 8 months, really.
We have a comment from Joelle that I think is very relevant. She says, you know, I've seen streets around me become more pedestrian friendly, more outdoor dining, more bike lanes. However, the public awareness to not drive in the bike lanes has not kept up at the same pace. So when you make these changes to your streets, what about enforcing those changes? Is that a real issue? David, you want to talk about Salem?
Well, I mean, when we introduce bike lanes anywhere, we're putting in vertical elements to essentially restrict vehicle access, where we use a lot of the white flex posts that you might see around cities to try to prevent that. We do have instances where we might have cars or trucks parked in there, and we try to work with police, you know, early on. I'm always trying to communicate with them as well as with fire to tell them when we're going to be, you know, even though it's paint and post, we're notifying them that there's going to be some changes to the roadway to just make sure they're aware. And if we do need enforcement to come in, that's certainly something we could do. I also wanted to just touch on something Warren was saying earlier. We're trying now to be as objective as we can when we're implementing these types of programs. And we'll always hear from the more affluent communities. Our challenge has been to try to, when we reach out to the less affluent, we don't always necessarily get any feedback. So that's something we're still struggling with and trying to do. So we started using GIS to map out all of the requests that we have and cross-reference that with demographic data, with land use data, to try to help us make sure that we're applying these limited resources that we as a city have to ensure that we're equitably distributing it. You know, that's something that we're still working on developing.
Let's see, we have our poll results from our last question about will the improvements create lasting changes. 55% say yes, 5% say no, but 41% say they're not sure. And I guess one of the questions I have is for Kate especially is, you know, it's great to get this money to implement all of these changes. What about maintaining them in the future? Is that going to be the cities and towns' responsibility financially to do, or will there be some additional financial aid from the state at some point?
It's a good question. I think, well, so I think backing up for a second, because this relates to the question of sort of whether and how some of these changes might become permanent. To me, this is a tiny subset of the question of our time, which is like, what are we going to learn from COVID, and how are we going to change, and are we going to change? And I could see this have gone in a completely opposite direction, which is people are scared, people feel vulnerable and under threat, so they dig in and they want nothing to change. Instead, it went the other way, which was that people embraced things that like allowed them to live in a way that was more familiar, but different at the same time, which was doing all these things outside. And like for me, I envy Warren. It's 46 and raining in Somerville right now, and I am having lunch outside with a friend today because that is my only way to have lunch with him. And that's a big change. I would not have done that a year ago in November. So I think there's sort of the meta question of what are people going to want? How are they going to want their streets to be different? But those things relate then to the micro questions of who keeps the flex posts up when they get knocked down, which they do all the time, and who's going to keep the paint up, which is expensive. And I'm already seeing the installations in my municipality, they're getting old, they're getting banged up and dinged. They're going to have to be, particularly the more temporary ones, are going to have to be kept up. We were very explicit for our program that we were paying for initial capital expenses, but then after that, anything municipalities bought or built was going to be their ongoing responsibility as their infrastructure is in general. We're now launching a second phase of the program, which is really to address the particular challenges of winter. But one of the things that we are making an eligibility criteria on is if you built a pilot in our first summer phase and now want to make it permanent, we will pay for you to do that. And part of that presumably is thinking about kind of longer term life cycle costs of whatever that thing is. But I guess my sort of jealous state perspective is what towns build become theirs, and they need to take care of them. But obviously we all have an interest in how this stuff gets kept over time, as we do with all public infrastructure.
Kate, I just want to add to your point really quickly. One, I will say that it's 46 degrees here, so it's not.
It's
not that different.
It's sunny.
I don't know if you can tell I'm like warming up my hands below my screen. The other thing I'll share though, and this is an evaluation I asked our safety leads to talk about, is because it said, it's taking a lot to like keep this program in shape. We have made a deal with all of our neighboring cities that we're not going to pick the same types of signs because we've caused like a statewide shortage in like traffic cones. And I'm not even kidding. You cannot buy traffic cones in California anymore. What's interesting.
It's the same here.
But yeah, like we all need to like pick and choose like the sawhorse or the A-frame. The interesting part though is that when I think about maintenance and when I think about the long-term cost of these programs, I'll say two things here. One, that people respect and maintain the programs that are fitting their needs, right? The fact that in some cases our dinky little A-frames are perfectly just hanging out and have no problem is telling me that all it took was a $25 A-frame on some of these streets that we were otherwise going to spend $1 million on. Which also then brings me to the cost of these programs, which is that our entire Slow Streets program to date has maybe cost us about $150,000 in capital, and that's just replacing orange cones that walk away every week. And then, the regular staff time that goes with that. In other cases though, that means that if we're only spending, pennies on the dollar in certain neighborhoods, and I would argue our more affluent neighborhoods have had a more successful Slow Streets program, it means that the millions of dollars that are left over in our capital funding, millions, we're shy on money right now, that we can devote then to the neighborhoods that need the more expensive programs. But if we're going to be, kind of looking comprehensively at a capital outlay, we say, okay, well, this street needs $1 million, this needs $1 million, this needs $1 million. And it's like, some of these streets don't need more than a stop sign. Just do that so that we can put $10 million towards the place that really needs it and deserves it. And that's kind of the other side of how I think about maintenance as well.
Okay. We just have a few minutes left. This has been a great discussion, by the way. I want to thank all of you. But the one thing that emerges from this for me is that how surprised all of you may have been to the reaction to this program. Kate referred to it a little bit by saying we thought people were really going to withdraw and not want to go outside or, and be involved at all with COVID. But it seems like you started something here and the reaction is much greater than you all anticipated. Is that true? We'll start with you, Kate.
Yeah, it's absolutely true for us. So we started with $5 million and we had serious differences of opinion internally about whether we would even be able to spend that money.
Really?
We overspent our $5 million. The state then gave us another $5 million and then another $200,000, and now they've given us another $10 million. And it feels like by the end of this, we will have spent $20 million in Massachusetts on shared streets and slow streets programs over the course of 9 months, which is unbelievable for us. And it feels right now like if the money kept coming, the applications would keep coming and we could just keep funding projects. There's so much interest. And one of the lessons for me, and this reflects our sort of state municipality lack of mutual understanding sometimes, is there was a lot more willingness on the part of municipalities to be flexible, to try new things than I might have expected. And I think the point that Warren made was exactly right for us too. You call something a pilot, you call something a trial, temporary, people are like, okay, whatever, do whatever. And that was true internally too. The folks who I work with who would want to spend 6 months reviewing a plan, we're like, oh, that's fine. Like, it's just gonna be up there for a couple of months. I don't need to look at it. And I think it was the same at the local level. So that allowed us to spend the money quickly, which allowed us to keep it going. So my hope is that the next 10 million gets spent equally well, and that the program can keep rolling in various ways.
How about
It's been amazing. It's been an amazing surprise.
Great. David, you in Salem, were you surprised at the reaction to the program?
As I mentioned earlier, I was very surprised that we virtually had zero pushback when we were taking parking spaces, a lot, double digits throughout the downtown, and that's still to this day. Obviously, we didn't have the demand for them that we normally would, but I was also surprised by how quickly the state moved with their programs, and was appreciative of that, which certainly allowed us to deploy some of these programs in a very quick fashion. I think, again, still struggling with some of the pushback we got from the through movements that we did. That's something that we, at least in Salem, still are trying to figure out. So it's more work to be done.
Do you have more projects that you could do if you had more money?
Certainly. I think what we'd like to do is take a more neighborhood zone approach to Shared Street, not just look at one street. You know, maybe that's just the way we implemented it, but look at it more as neighborhood based. Perhaps looking at our bike master plan a little more closely and implementing that a little more comprehensively, because we did see that traffic was going in other streets, and we certainly heard from those neighbors. So that's something I'd like to continue working on to do that. To when we implement it, do it more neighborhood based.
It seems like once you get going here, you see a lot more possibilities. How about out there in Oakland, Warren? Do you see this program continuing and expanding?
I do, and to sort of answer your first question as well, I'm actually personally not surprised at the positive and negative reactions we've seen to this, in part because we're providing something that people said they wanted a long time ago, and we've made it easier for them to do that. Like, I don't think anyone should really be surprised by that. I think, though, that people have been surprised at how quickly we have demonstrated we can be responsive. And I think we've surprised ourselves in our ability. And I want to kind of remind all of you out there, and really my own staff as well, that we are in fact capable of being responsive governments if we get out of our own way, right? If we allow ourselves to be. And I think that is the seminal argument for shared streets, slow streets, flex streets, you name it, is that it's not that any one of these is perhaps better than the other. It's that we are finally responding to a community's needs in real time. And if it's not working, demonstrating that we can quickly adjust, pivot, monitor, change in a way that does not require, to your point, Kate, 6 months of hand wringing, 18 months of design, 30 years of plan, like NEPA, CEQA requirement, right? Like, hey, I like this idea. Let's try it. Oh, didn't work. Let's change it. Like, that is the type of attitude that I hope that we're all kind of bringing beyond COVID is this hyper responsiveness and better engagement. And that no one is then surprised that their government is responding to their needs.
And that's
I want to thank Tracy. You want to have any final comments here?
Yeah, I think that this has been a fantastic conversation, just talking about, as we talk about equitable transit-oriented development and what that really means. I'm talking about starting with people. And there's the whole concept of shared streets, of kind of shifting the focus from cars to people is a key component of that. And I think that what we've heard here today is that, this kind of experimentation that has been happening with street interventions, of kind of taking what people are hearing from communities, hearing from cities, and letting them kind of lead the way, getting the bureaucracy out of the way, that is making a huge difference in promoting equity in the ways in which we think about our neighborhoods, our communities, and our cities. So thank you, everyone.
And thank you, Tracy, for initiating this whole series. Another great program this morning. Thanks to your leadership. And of course, our guest, we want to thank David Kucharsky, Director of Traffic and Parking for the City of Salem, who's still recovering from Halloween.
Thank you.
From MassDOT, who's doing such a great job administering this program and keeping up with all the millions of dollars she's got to spend. And Warren Logan for getting up early out there in Oakland, California. You look more wide awake than we did this morning. I want to thank you, Warren, for adding such valuable information about what's happening out there. And of course, we want to thank all of you who have participated this morning. This is being recorded and will be available. And any questions we didn't get to, we'll try to answer. We have them in our Q&A tab, and we'll try to do that for you. But Thank you for a great program this morning, and stay tuned. We'll be back with another one in December. We'll let you know when that'll be happening. And this has been a great series, and we want to thank all of you who have participated. So thanks for being here with us this morning, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Nice weekend.